Hey guys, tonight we're venturing deep into the heart of one of the most fascinating civilizations to ever rise on Earth, the Aztecs. Picture this: towering stone temples, markets bustling with goods from all corners of Mesoamerica, and a people who, at their peak, dominated much of present-day Mexico. But let's get something straight. You probably won't survive this journey. And I mean that in the most historically accurate way. The Aztecs had some intense ways of showing their dominance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, settle in, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in the early days of the Aztec civilization. But they weren't called the Aztecs yet. They were the Mexica, a group of nomadic people who originally came from the northern regions of Mexico. It's safe to say they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms in the area they eventually made their home. They had to fight for their land and their place in history, starting as outsiders, and slowly but surely working their way up. Picture this: a small group of warriors moving from one place to the next, gathering strength and allies, until one day they set foot on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. There, the Mexica saw an omen, a symbol in the sky, an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its beak. This was a sign that they were meant to create something great. Historians still argue whether the story of the eagle and cactus was purely symbolic or whether it was rooted in real historical events. One thing is certain: the Mexica, now with a divine sign, were about to begin a journey that would lead to the birth of Tenochtitlán. This small island in Lake Texcoco would become the heart of an empire that spanned vast territories. For the Mexica, this was their destiny. The island they chose for their capital was hardly an ideal spot for a city. It was surrounded by water, difficult to reach, and with a tricky geography. But what the Mexica lacked in land, they more than made up for with ingenuity. They built chinampas, man-made islands that floated on the water, using reed mats and mud to create fertile land for agriculture. This allowed them to grow food even in the middle of a lake, something no one had ever seen before. And by the time their city was fully established, Tenochtitlán had transformed into a marvel of engineering and planning. Tenochtitlán grew fast, really fast. It was like a young, ambitious city that just couldn't stop growing. This island in the middle of Lake Texcoco was suddenly the hub of commerce, culture, and politics in the Valley of Mexico. The Mexica people built causeways, long roads that connected the island to the mainland. And these roads were lined with markets and bustling trade. If you could imagine walking down one of these causeways, the air would be thick with the smell of spices, fresh food, and handmade goods from every corner of Mesoamerica. The city's population skyrocketed as more and more people moved in to witness this overnight success. But the Mexica didn't build an empire overnight. They had a vision, and they were ruthless in their pursuit of it. Historians still argue whether the Mexica's rise to power was purely a result of their military prowess, or if it had more to do with their religious and social structures. One thing is clear: they were both warriors and diplomats, and they knew how to play the game. They built alliances with other city-states, but they were also cunning enough to dominate those alliances when the time came. By the time the Mexica were ready to go to war, they were a well-organized force, armed with jagged obsidian blades, shields, and wooden clubs that were used in hand-to-hand combat. They were also master archers, using blowguns to shoot poison darts at their enemies from a distance. But the Aztecs, or Mexica as they were known at this stage, were not just about warfare. Their society was built on religion, and this was the glue that held everything together. The Mexica believed that the gods required nourishment in the form of human sacrifice, a practice that, to outsiders, may seem horrifying, but was, to the Mexica, essential for keeping the world in balance. The Aztecs had a pantheon of gods. Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, was one of the most powerful and revered. He was their divine guide, their protector, and their justification for the endless wars they fought. The Aztecs believed that if they didn't offer sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli and the other gods, the sun would stop rising, and the world would fall into chaos. This deep religious devotion was at the heart of their identity. But it wasn't just the warriors who were involved in these rituals. The people of Tenochtitlan believed that their everyday lives were intricately connected to the divine. Even the king, or Tlatoani, was seen as a living god, a representative of the gods on earth. Historians still debate whether this divine kingship was more about political power, or whether the Mexica truly believed that their rulers were directly descended from the gods. Whatever the case, the Tlatoani was not just a political figure. He was a spiritual leader, and his role was tied to the fate of the entire city. While the Mexica were worshipping, fighting wars, and building one of the most powerful empires in Mesoamerica, the city of Tenochtitlan became more and more awe-inspiring. Its grand temples and palaces towered over the city, and the centerpiece, the great temple of Tenochtitlan, was a symbol of the Mexica's divine power. This pyramid-like structure was dedicated to both Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the god of rain, and it was said to be adorned with vibrant colors and precious stones. But more than just a beautiful structure, it was the epicenter of the Mexica's religious and military life, the place where sacrifices were made and the gods were called upon for victory. The Mexica's empire wasn't just built on might and religion. It also rested on a very particular form of organization. They were like the ultimate bureaucrats of the ancient world. Once the Mexica began to expand beyond Tenochtitlan, they formed an empire that stretched across central Mexico, incorporating a mix of conquered peoples and allies into their system. Instead of simply absorbing these people into their ranks by force, they utilized a system of tribute that allowed them to control vast territories with relatively little resistance. Those who were conquered didn't always have to change their ways, but they did have to pay tribute to the Mexica, usually in the form of goods like food, textiles, or precious metals. It was almost like an early tax system, but with less paperwork and more swords. The Mexica were keen to maintain their military power and could be harsh in their punishment of anyone who resisted the system. But they also knew that it wasn't enough to just conquer. They had to keep things running smoothly. It's funny to think that despite the bloody wars, conquests, and endless sacrifices, the Mexica were actually masters of trade and economics. Their city was a major trade hub, connected to the rest of Mesoamerica by a system of roads and canals. This allowed for the exchange of everything from food to precious jade, exotic birds, and even feathers, which were highly valued. The Mexica were also very skilled farmers, using advanced techniques like chinampas, or floating gardens, to maximize the use of their swampy lake environment. These man-made islands allowed the Mexica to grow food for their rapidly growing population. The islands were so efficient that they could produce several harvests a year, ensuring that the Mexica never had to worry about running out of food, even during times of war. This agricultural ingenuity played a major role in the Mexica's ability to build such a vast empire. But it wasn't just their physical infrastructure or agricultural innovation that made the Mexica Empire so successful. It was also their ability to foster a complex social and political system. The Mexica were very hierarchical, with the king, or Tlatoani, sitting at the top. Below him were a series of officials, priests, and military leaders, each with their own responsibilities and ranks. The common people, who made up the bulk of the population, were often farmers, artisans, or merchants, and their social status was largely determined by their wealth and profession. One thing that set the Mexica apart from many other ancient civilizations, however, was their ability to include certain conquered peoples in this system. Some of the more strategically important cities or groups were allowed to maintain a degree of autonomy, while still paying tribute to the Mexica. It was this careful balance between control and cooperation that helped the Mexica expand their empire without constantly fighting all of their subject peoples. Historians still argue over how much the Mexica relied on military conquest to maintain their empire, versus how much they depended on diplomacy and alliances. What is clear is that they were incredibly successful at using both. The Mexica knew that diplomacy was just as important as war, and used their religious practices and military strength to win over new allies. They were keen negotiators, willing to offer protection and trade in exchange for loyalty and tribute. The people they conquered often found themselves integrated into the Mexica's social structure, and over time, many of them adopted the Mexica's language, customs, and religious practices. In many ways, the Mexica Empire was like a patchwork quilt, woven together with bits of diplomacy, trade, and warfare. But all this success came at a cost. While the Mexica were able to maintain peace with some of their subjects, they could also be ruthless when it came to rebellion. If a city or tribe refused to pay tribute or tried to break free from Mexica rule, the punishment was often swift and brutal. The Mexica would send in their armies, and once the city was conquered, they would often destroy temples and sacred sites to demonstrate their dominance. This created a certain level of fear among the people of Mesoamerica, but it also gave rise to resentment. The idea that the Mexica could be both feared and respected made their empire an intriguing mix of oppression and innovation. As the Mexica's empire continued to grow, so did their architectural feats. In the center of Tenochtitlan, the Great Temple was the beating heart of their religious and military power. But the Mexica also built impressive palaces, markets, and aqueducts to support their growing population. The Tlatelolco market, for example, was a bustling hub where thousands of traders gathered daily to exchange goods. It was one of the largest and most important markets in the world at the time. The Mexica were not just about military conquest. They were also keenly aware of the need for infrastructure to support their people. Now, while it's clear the Mexica had built a mighty empire, they weren't exactly sitting pretty. There were still some looming issues on the horizon, and their way of life was constantly being tested. For one, while the Mexica's control over their tributary cities seemed unshakable, there was always the ever-present risk of internal conflict. With so many different tribes and cultures integrated into their empire, the risk of rebellion was constant. Not to mention, the Mexica were on the edge of their world, surrounded by powerful and ambitious neighbors like the Tarascans and the Zapotecs. There was never a guarantee that the Mexica's reign would last forever. In many ways, they were always bracing for a potential uprising, knowing that the balance between power and peace was fragile. But the Mexica weren't all about war and tribute. One of the most fascinating aspects of their empire was their deep connection to religion, which permeated nearly every aspect of daily life. The Mexica believed that their gods required constant nourishment through ritual sacrifice, often human sacrifice. This practice has earned the Mexica a lot of attention in history, and it's something that modern scholars continue to debate. While some see it as a dark and brutal part of Mexica culture, others argue that it was central to their worldview and their understanding of their place in the cosmos. They didn't see sacrifice as mere bloodshed. To the Mexica, it was a way of maintaining the balance between the gods and the earth. The sun god, Huitzilopochtli, was a primary figure in these rituals, and the Mexica believed that offering him blood was necessary to keep the sun rising and to prevent the world from falling into darkness. This belief tied their religious practices to every major event, from wars to the changing of the seasons. Imagine living in a society where the rising sun itself was a direct result of the sacrifices you made. Despite the intensity of their religious rituals, the Mexica had an astonishingly sophisticated understanding of the world. They were skilled astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers. They tracked the cycles of the moon, the planets, and the stars with remarkable precision, and they based their agricultural calendar on these observations. This calendar was crucial to the Mexica, as it helped them plan everything from crop planting to religious festivals. The Mexica even built observatories, such as the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, where priests would use their vast knowledge of the stars to determine when to hold sacred ceremonies. Their approach to astronomy wasn't just about practicality. It was about connecting the physical world to the divine. Historians still argue about the full extent of the Mexica's knowledge. Some scholars suggest that the Mexica were ahead of their time, with an understanding of astronomy and mathematics that rivaled that of the Old World. Others believe that their knowledge was more intuitive, based on centuries of observing the stars and nature. What is clear, however, is that the Mexica didn't see themselves as separate from the world around them. They viewed everything, the stars, the earth, the animals, as interconnected in a vast web of life, death, and rebirth. Their religious beliefs reflected this, and it gave their empire a sense of unity that stretched from the top of the pyramid to the lowest rungs of society. But life in the Mexica Empire wasn't just about astronomical knowledge or religious devotion. It was also about daily survival. And that meant relying on agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. As mentioned earlier, the Mexica were master farmers, using ingenious methods to grow crops in their swampy environment. But they didn't just rely on traditional farming methods. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems to bring water to the fields, and they practiced crop rotation to ensure the soil didn't lose its fertility. These techniques allowed them to feed an ever-growing population in the capital city. But food wasn't the only thing they exchanged. The Mexica were also known for their elaborate textiles, pottery, and jewelry. They had a highly developed craft industry, and their artwork was renowned for its beauty and precision. The Mexica's ability to manage their empire was also reflected in their military strategies. Though they were not the only military power in Mesoamerica, they were by far the most successful at integrating military conquest into their economic and religious systems. The Mexica used their army not just to fight wars, but to maintain control over their growing empire. They required tribute from the cities they conquered, but they also demanded loyalty. And this was achieved by incorporating the conquered peoples into the Mexica's social structure. These people, while often paying tribute, were not entirely subjugated. In fact, many of them participated in religious ceremonies and were even given the opportunity to rise in status through military achievements. It's a strange concept when you think about it. Your conquerors offering you the chance to gain power, but only if you play by their rules. Historians still debate whether the Mexica's system of tribute and military service was effective in the long run. Some argue that the constant expansion of the Mexica Empire was unsustainable, that the need for tribute and loyalty would eventually lead to a rebellion. Others suggest that the Mexica's military and social system was so deeply ingrained in their culture that they could have continued to thrive for much longer if they hadn't been interrupted by the arrival of the Spanish. As you wander through Tenochtitlan in your mind's eye, imagine the bustling markets filled with every possible good you can think of. Cacao beans, feathers from exotic birds, intricate jewelry, and vibrant textiles. This city, founded on the marshes of Lake Texcoco, was a marvel of urban planning. It was the heart of the Mexica Empire, a city of stunning beauty and sophistication. Despite its location on an island, Tenochtitlan was a hub of trade and culture. Through a vast network of causeways and canals, the Mexica were able to connect their island city to the mainland, allowing for easy transportation of goods and people. These causeways were lined with markets where merchants from all over Mesoamerica came to trade. Interestingly, the Mexica didn't rely solely on large-scale farming to feed their population. They also developed a form of agriculture called chinampa, or floating gardens. These were man-made islands that floated on the surface of Lake Texcoco, created by piling mud and vegetation on reed mats. This system allowed the Mexica to grow food in otherwise unproductive areas of the lake. On these chinampas, they cultivated maize, beans, squash, and other staple crops. The floating gardens were incredibly efficient, yielding multiple harvests per year, and they helped support the large population of Tenochtitlan. Historians still argue about how the Mexica were able to achieve such sophisticated agricultural techniques, considering the limited technology they had. Some scholars believe that the Mexica had developed a detailed understanding of their environment, using the natural resources around them to their advantage. Others suggest that the Chinampa system was not unique to the Mexica, but had been used by earlier Mesoamerican civilizations, and the Mexica simply perfected it. One of the most unique aspects of Tenochtitlan was its urban layout. The city was divided into 4 zones, each with its own distinct character. The central area of the city was home to the Templo Mayor, the grandest temple of all, dedicated to the Mexica gods Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The temple was not just a religious center, but a symbol of Mexica power, rising high above the rest of the city. Surrounding the Templo Mayor were marketplaces, residential areas, and government buildings. The Mexica also created public spaces for recreation, including ball courts, where the infamous Mesoamerican ball game was played. The Mexica didn't just view Tenochtitlan as a city. They viewed it as the center of the world, a divine reflection of the universe itself. They believed that their city, with its concentric circles and temples dedicated to the gods, mirrored the sacred layout of the cosmos. This connection to the divine was reinforced by the elaborate religious ceremonies held in the city. Tenochtitlan was the site of grand festivals and rituals, some of which involved human sacrifice. To the Mexica, these rituals were necessary to keep the gods satisfied and ensure the continued prosperity of their empire. Even though Tenochtitlan was a center of power, it was not invincible. The Mexica's empire, as vast and powerful as it was, had its share of vulnerabilities. The reliance on tribute from conquered peoples, while effective in maintaining control, also bred resentment. The Mexica demanded tribute in the form of goods, labor, and, most controversially, human sacrifice. This constant demand for resources could strain relationships with the subjugated peoples, and historians still debate whether this contributed to the eventual downfall of the empire. Was the Mexica Empire too large and too dependent on its tributary system to maintain its power? Or were the cracks in the empire merely a product of the Spanish invasion? As the Mexica were enjoying the height of their empire, they also faced threats from within. The rising tension between the Mexica and their neighboring states like the Tlaxcalans was always a source of concern. These tensions eventually led to alliances with rival groups. The Tlaxcalans, who were sworn enemies of the Mexica, would eventually play a key role in the conquest of the Mexica by the Spanish. Historians argue over how these alliances shaped the Mexica's fate. Some believe the alliances with other indigenous groups were the Mexica's way of ensuring their survival, while others think that these alliances were just part of a larger strategy to dominate the region. Despite these internal and external challenges, the Mexica continued to expand their empire. They did so through a combination of military conquest and diplomacy, using both force and negotiation to bring new cities into their fold. One of their most remarkable feats was their ability to build and maintain a sophisticated network of roads and communication. These roads connected the cities of the Mexica Empire, allowing for the rapid movement of troops, goods, and information. The Mexica were also skilled at administration, with an organized bureaucracy that helped manage the vast empire. Despite the challenges they faced, the Mexica were able to maintain their empire for nearly 2 centuries before the arrival of the Spanish. The Mexica Empire's expansion reached its peak under the reign of Moctezuma II, one of the most famous rulers in Mexica history. Moctezuma II came to power in the early 16th century, and under his rule, the Mexica continued to expand their territories through military conquest and diplomacy. However, during his reign, the Mexica were faced with a challenge unlike any they had encountered before: foreign invaders. Moctezuma's reign was marked by both grandeur and uncertainty. His court was known for its opulence, and he is said to have been surrounded by vast wealth. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, had grown to be a thriving metropolis, with a population in the hundreds of thousands. It was a city of towering temples, magnificent palaces, and bustling marketplaces. The Mexicas' power and influence stretched across Mesoamerica, and they were at the height of their imperial ambitions. Yet, despite their great wealth and power, the Mexica were not invincible. Historians still debate how much the Mexica knew about the approaching Spanish. Some argue that Moctezuma was aware of the Spanish presence in the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast, while others believe he was completely caught off guard by their arrival. Either way, the Mexica Empire found itself facing an enemy that no amount of tribute or military might could have anticipated. The Spanish, led by Hernán Cortés, arrived on the coast of what is now Mexico in 1519, and their journey into the heart of the Mexica Empire would lead to the destruction of one of the most advanced civilizations of the time. At first, Moctezuma welcomed the Spanish, possibly out of curiosity or a belief that they were representatives of the gods. This decision has been widely debated by historians. Some suggest that Moctezuma may have seen the Spanish as divine beings, interpreting their arrival as a fulfillment of prophecy. According to Mexica belief, the god Quetzalcoatl was said to return from the east in a time of great turmoil. With the Spanish ships appearing on the horizon, it's not entirely unreasonable to think that Moctezuma saw this as a sign from the gods. However, historians also point out that Moctezuma was a highly intelligent and calculating ruler, and it's unlikely he would have been completely fooled by the Spanish. Some believe that he initially sought to maintain diplomacy with the Spanish, possibly in an effort to gain more information or to avoid conflict. Regardless of his intentions, the Mexica were soon drawn into a complex relationship with the Spanish. Cortés, who had already formed alliances with indigenous groups who were enemies of the Mexica, began to gain the trust of the Mexica people. These alliances would later prove to be crucial in the Spanish conquest. Historians still argue about the exact nature of the Mexica-Spanish relationship. Was Moctezuma simply overwhelmed by the arrival of the Spanish? Or did he believe that cooperating with them would strengthen his rule? What is clear is that the Mexica were not prepared for the impact that the Spanish would have on their empire. The Spanish were armed with advanced weapons, including guns and cannons, which the Mexica had never seen before. They also brought horses, which gave them a significant military advantage over the Mexica, who relied on foot soldiers. But perhaps the most devastating weapon the Spanish had was the disease they brought with them. The Spanish brought smallpox, a disease that decimated the indigenous population across the Americas. The Mexica, like many other native groups, had no immunity to these diseases. Smallpox spread quickly throughout the empire, killing thousands, including some of the Mexica's elite. The combination of disease, military technology, and strategic alliances with other indigenous groups created a perfect storm for the downfall of the Mexica Empire. As the Spanish advanced toward Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma's once great city began to fall. The Mexica's gods had not arrived to save them. Instead, the Spanish and their indigenous allies slowly encircled the city. The Mexica attempted to resist, but their forces were spread thin. The city, once a beacon of Mexica power, was now under siege. Despite their military prowess, the Mexica were unable to stop the invaders. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked the end of the Mexica Empire. Historians often debate how much resistance the Mexica truly put up against the Spanish. Some suggest that Moctezuma's leadership faltered during the siege, as his subjects began to lose faith in him. Others believe that the Mexica were simply overwhelmed by the strength of the Spanish and their allies. What is clear is that the fall of Tenochtitlan was not due to a lack of will or strength. It was the result of a combination of factors, including foreign invasion, disease, and internal division. The conquest of the Mexica by the Spanish is often seen as one of the most tragic events in history. A powerful civilization, with rich cultural traditions and remarkable achievements, was destroyed in a matter of years. However, the legacy of the Mexica continues to live on, both in the Andean region and in the cultural practices that have survived the centuries. Though the Mexica Empire fell, the spirit of its people and their contributions to human history remain an important part of our shared legacy. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica Empire ceased to exist in its original form, but the consequences of its collapse were far-reaching. The Spanish, now in control of the vast territory that had once belonged to the Mexica, began to reshape the region to suit their own colonial goals. This period, which marked the beginning of New Spain, would change the cultural, social, and political landscape of the Americas forever. The Spanish, under the leadership of Hernán Cortés, quickly began to build their colonial empire on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. They began by dismantling the Mexica capital and using its resources to construct a new Spanish colonial city, which would become the City of Mexico, the heart of Spanish power in the Americas. The Spanish not only took control of the physical landscape, but also sought to impose their own religious, cultural, and political systems on the indigenous population. One of the most significant aspects of Spanish colonization was the forced conversion of the indigenous peoples to Christianity. The Spanish, motivated by their desire to spread Catholicism, began a widespread campaign of evangelization. Missionaries were sent to every corner of the empire, and churches were built over the sacred temples of the Mexica. The Mexica's polytheistic religion, which had been integral to their society, was replaced by Christianity, and many of the ancient practices of the Mexica were banned. Historians still debate the extent to which the Mexica resisted the Spanish imposition of Christianity. Some argue that the Mexica saw the arrival of Christianity as a continuation of their own spiritual traditions, while others believe that the Mexica fiercely resisted the Spanish conversion efforts. What is clear is that the process of conversion was far from peaceful. The Mexica, who had long revered their gods and rituals, found themselves caught between the forces of spiritual colonization and the imposition of a foreign belief system. The Spaniards used various methods to enforce conversion, including the destruction of religious icons and the forced attendance of indigenous peoples at Christian services. They also implemented the encomienda system, a form of forced labor that required indigenous people to work on Spanish-owned lands in exchange for Christian teachings and protection. However, the reality of the encomienda system was far harsher than it was presented. The system led to the exploitation and mistreatment of the indigenous population, and many Mexica and other indigenous peoples were forced into servitude under the guise of religious conversion. In addition to the religious changes, the Spanish introduced new forms of governance and social structures that completely disrupted the traditional Mexica way of life. The Aztec social hierarchy, which had been based on the worship of the gods and the leadership of the emperor, was replaced with a colonial caste system. The Spanish placed themselves at the top of this new hierarchy, with mestizos, mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, below them, and indigenous people relegated to the bottom. The impact of this new system was profound, as it stripped the Mexica of their political power and severely altered their social structure. Despite these hardships, the Mexica and other indigenous peoples did not simply disappear. Over time, they began to adapt to their new circumstances, blending their cultural practices with the influence of Spanish colonialism. One of the most significant examples of this is the blending of Catholicism with Mexica religious practices. Many indigenous communities continued to honor their traditional deities and perform ancient rituals, but they also adopted Christian symbols and saints into their religious practices. This syncretism, a fusion of the old and the new, became a hallmark of Mexican culture and would influence the development of a unique, hybrid identity that blended indigenous and European traditions. Historians often point to this period of syncretism as an example of resilience in the face of colonial domination. While the Spanish tried to erase the Mexica's cultural identity, the indigenous people found ways to preserve their traditions, adapting them to the new colonial reality. For example, Mexica deities were often merged with Catholic saints, and ancient rituals were adapted into Catholic festivals. This blending of cultures became a crucial part of Mexico's identity, which would continue to evolve over the centuries. As the Spanish continued to establish their colonial empire, they also introduced new technologies, crops, and animals to the Americas. The Columbian Exchange, as it is known, brought horses, cattle, wheat, and sugar to the New World. These new crops and animals had a profound impact on the indigenous peoples of the Americas, both in terms of their agriculture and their daily lives. The introduction of horses, for example, transformed indigenous warfare and transportation, and the cultivation of European crops such as wheat reshaped the agricultural landscape of Mexico. However, the Columbian Exchange also had devastating consequences for the indigenous populations. The introduction of European diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles decimated the native population, which had no immunity to these foreign illnesses. It is estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population in the Americas died as a result of European diseases, leading to a dramatic decline in the number of Mexica and other indigenous peoples. The loss of life was catastrophic, and the demographic changes caused by these diseases would have lasting effects on the region for centuries to come. Despite these challenges, the Mexica legacy lived on. The ruins of Tenochtitlan, now part of Mexico City, continue to stand as a testament to the Mexica's achievements in architecture, engineering, and society. The influence of the Mexica is also seen in Mexican culture, from the food that is still enjoyed today, such as tacos and chilies, to the language spoken by millions of people. Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, continues to be spoken by some indigenous communities in Mexico. The Spanish conquest of the Mexica Empire may have marked the end of an era, but it did not erase the cultural and spiritual contributions of the Mexica people. Their resilience and ability to adapt to changing circumstances allowed them to survive in the face of adversity and to leave a lasting legacy that continues to influence Mexico and the world today. As the Spanish solidified their control over what had once been the mighty Mexica Empire, the new colonial administration began to expand its influence across all of New Spain. The Spanish were determined to extract wealth and resources from their new territory, and the labor of the indigenous people became essential to their colonial economy. This period marked the rise of colonial exploitation and the entrenchment of Spanish power in the Americas. One of the key methods used by the Spanish to control the indigenous population was the encomienda system. This system, which had already been implemented in other parts of the Spanish colonies, involved granting Spanish settlers and soldiers the right to extract labor from indigenous communities. In exchange for their labor, the Spanish were supposed to offer protection and religious instruction. However, the reality of the encomienda system was much harsher. Many indigenous people were subjected to grueling labor on Spanish-owned plantations and mines, often working under brutal conditions, with little regard for their well-being. The encomienda system was not just about economic exploitation. It also sought to erase indigenous culture. Indigenous peoples were forced to convert to Christianity and abandon their traditional practices. Spanish missionaries played a key role in this process, establishing churches and converting the indigenous population to Catholicism. The Spanish believed that their religious duty was to save the souls of the indigenous people, but their efforts were also an attempt to assert dominance over a conquered population by eliminating their spiritual and cultural practices. Despite the efforts to force indigenous peoples into submission, many resisted Spanish rule in various ways. Rebellions and uprisings were common during this time, as indigenous communities fought to maintain their way of life. One of the most significant uprisings occurred in the early 16th century, when the Pueblo people in what is now New Mexico rebelled against Spanish rule. Led by a religious leader named Pope, the Pueblo people successfully expelled the Spanish for a period of time, showing that indigenous resistance was not easily quashed. Historians still argue over the extent to which indigenous resistance was organized and coordinated. Some argue that the rebellions were isolated, local events driven by specific grievances, while others suggest that there was a broader, more organized effort to push back against colonial rule. What is clear, however, is that the Spanish faced significant challenges in maintaining control over their vast empire, and they had to constantly contend with uprisings, resistance, and rebellion. In addition to the encomienda system, the Spanish also implemented the repartimiento system, which was another form of forced labor. Under this system, indigenous people were required to work for a set period of time for the Spanish, typically on public works projects or in mining operations. The repartimiento system was particularly harmful because it allowed for the exploitation of indigenous peoples without the legal protections of the encomienda system. It led to widespread abuse, as the Spanish could demand long hours and harsh working conditions from indigenous laborers without offering any compensation. While the Spanish economic system relied heavily on forced labor, it also depended on new agricultural practices and trade. The introduction of European crops such as wheat and sugar transformed the agricultural landscape of the Americas. The Spanish also introduced cattle and horses, which had a profound impact on indigenous ways of life. Many indigenous peoples who had once relied on hunting and fishing now found themselves working with the new animals and crops introduced by the Spanish. This created a cultural shift, as indigenous peoples were forced to adapt to new agricultural practices and modes of production. Trade between New Spain and Spain itself played a crucial role in the economic growth of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish began to extract vast quantities of silver and gold from mines in Mexico and Peru, which helped fuel Spain's economy. The mining industry in Mexico, particularly in the Zacatecas and Potosí regions, became a major source of wealth for the Spanish. However, the mining industry was also deeply destructive to the indigenous population. Indigenous workers were forced to work in the mines under dangerous conditions, often exposed to toxic mercury and harsh weather. Many died from diseases or injuries sustained in the mines. At the same time, the Spanish economy in New Spain was also bolstered by the plantation economy. Spanish settlers established plantations that produced goods such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco for export to Spain and other parts of Europe. The labor-intensive nature of these plantations led to the continued exploitation of indigenous labor, who were forced to work the land under harsh conditions. Over time, the use of African slaves was introduced into the plantation system, further exacerbating the exploitation of both African and indigenous peoples. Despite the heavy exploitation and cultural suppression, indigenous people continued to find ways to resist and preserve their traditions. Many retained their language and spiritual practices in secret, blending them with Christian teachings in a form of religious syncretism. Indigenous communities also continued to engage in traditional agricultural practices, using small-scale farming techniques that had been passed down for generations. These practices were often in direct contrast to the large-scale exploitative systems imposed by the Spanish. As time went on, the Spanish began to incorporate more indigenous peoples into their colonial system. Some were granted land and privileges in exchange for loyalty to the Spanish crown, while others were allowed to participate in trade and agricultural practices. However, this integration came at a high cost, as indigenous people were still subjected to heavy taxation and forced labor. The idea of social mobility was an illusion for most indigenous people, as they remained firmly entrenched at the bottom of the colonial social ladder. Historians still debate the long-term impact of Spanish colonialism on the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Some argue that the introduction of European systems and technologies allowed for the eventual integration of indigenous peoples into the broader colonial economy, while others maintain that Spanish rule destroyed much of the Mexica culture and led to the near annihilation of indigenous traditions. Regardless of the viewpoint, it is clear that the colonial period had a lasting impact on the indigenous peoples of Mexico, shaping their future in ways that would be felt for centuries to come. As the Spanish solidified their hold over New Spain, the forces of colonialism began to shape the culture, economy, and governance of the territory. However, beneath the surface of Spanish dominance, a new and complex system of colonial society took shape. Over time, the Spanish crown, while maintaining control over the administration, found itself relying increasingly on local elites, including both indigenous and mixed-race mestizo populations, to help manage the sprawling empire. This system was built on a rigid social hierarchy that privileged those of European descent while relegating indigenous peoples and Africans to the lowest rungs of society. At the top of the colonial social structure were the peninsulares, individuals born in Spain who held the most powerful positions in government and the Catholic Church. Below them were the Creoles, descendants of Spanish settlers born in the Americas, who, while wealthy, were excluded from the highest offices in the colony. The mestizos, or mixed-race individuals, occupied a middle tier, and below them were the indigenous peoples and Africans, who were subject to the most exploitation and discrimination. The hierarchical system was not purely based on race, but also on the degree of Spanish ancestry one had. This system of racial classification became central to the colonial administration, influencing everything from marriage to property rights to the ability to hold office. It was in this context that the Spanish sought to consolidate their rule over the vast and diverse population of New Spain, including the remnants of the Mexica Empire. At the same time, the Catholic Church played an increasingly prominent role in the social and cultural fabric of New Spain. The Spanish crown sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, using both coercive and persuasive methods. Missionaries traveled deep into the heart of the territory, setting up missions where they would teach the Christian faith, European agricultural methods, and other elements of Spanish culture. The Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit orders played key roles in these efforts, establishing settlements and educational institutions that would serve both as centers of Christian instruction and as tools of colonial control. The Catholic Church was also instrumental in the construction of a colonial identity. Catholicism was the one constant that tied the diverse peoples of New Spain together, and the Church's influence was felt not only in the spread of religion, but also in local governance. The clergy often held significant political power, and their influence could be seen in both the day-to-day life of the colonies and in the larger political decisions of the Spanish crown. In fact, many of the Spanish colonial officials were closely tied to the Church, with bishops and priests often serving as advisors to the crown. Yet, despite the efforts to impose a unified colonial identity, regionalism remained strong. The geographical distance and cultural diversity of the empire made it difficult for the Spanish crown to exercise direct control over all of New Spain. Local leaders, whether indigenous, mestizo, or Spanish, often acted autonomously in their regions, establishing informal power structures that competed with official colonial institutions. These tensions would simmer for years, contributing to the growing discontent that would eventually lead to uprisings and rebellion. While the Spanish crown tried to project an image of stability and unity, the reality was that New Spain was a patchwork of competing interests, with a diverse population constantly negotiating for better treatment and rights. Over time, the tensions between the Creoles and the Peninsulares would lead to political unrest. Creoles, feeling excluded from the highest positions of power, began to question the legitimacy of Spanish rule, and many began to consider the possibility of independence. One of the most significant factors influencing this political unrest was the growing influence of Enlightenment ideas. The ideas of individual rights, democracy, and national sovereignty, which had taken hold in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, found a receptive audience in the Americas. These revolutionary ideas encouraged a generation of Creoles and mestizos to challenge the colonial hierarchy and demand a system that allowed for greater autonomy and equality. Historians still argue about the exact influence of these Enlightenment ideals on the Spanish colonies. Some suggest that they were a primary driver of the eventual independence movements, while others argue that economic factors, such as the decline in the profitability of the colonial economy, played a more significant role. What is clear is that by the early 19th century, the ideas of liberty and self-determination had taken root among many of the colonial elites, creating the intellectual and political foundation for independence movements that would spread across Latin America. At the same time, the African slave trade continued to play an integral role in the economic and social system of New Spain. Slaves were brought from West Africa to work in the plantations, mines, and households of Spanish settlers, and over time, they became an essential part of the colonial workforce. The integration of enslaved Africans into the colonial economy was deeply intertwined with the treatment of indigenous labor, and both groups faced exploitation and harsh conditions. Yet, despite the brutal nature of their lives, many enslaved Africans found ways to resist their circumstances. Whether through rebellion, escape, or preserving African cultural traditions, enslaved peoples created communities that helped maintain their sense of identity. This resistance, though often suppressed, became a central part of the broader movement for independence, as enslaved Africans, along with indigenous people and mestizos, began to demand freedom from colonial rule. The struggle for freedom was not limited to economic and social concerns. As New Spain continued to evolve, the legacy of the Mexica Empire, including its organizational structure, military prowess, and cultural achievements, remained an important part of the region's identity. Many indigenous and mestizo people took pride in their connection to the Mexica past, even as the Spanish sought to erase it. The memory of Mexica military victories, architectural marvels, and cultural traditions continued to serve as a source of pride and resilience, especially as the Spanish continued their efforts to impose their culture and religion. By the end of the 18th century, New Spain had become a hotbed of political and cultural tension. The Spanish crown's efforts to maintain control were becoming increasingly difficult, and the colonial elite was growing more restless. The cultural transformation that had been underway for centuries was about to reach a boiling point. The stage was set for the Mexican War of Independence, which would begin in 1810 and fundamentally alter the future of the territory. The Mexican War of Independence marked a dramatic turning point in the history of New Spain, as tensions between the Spanish crown and colonial subjects finally erupted into open rebellion. It all began in 1810, when a Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo issued the famous Grito de Dolores, calling for the end of Spanish rule, the abolition of slavery, and the redistribution of land to the indigenous people. This declaration was not just a rallying cry. It represented the culmination of years of social unrest and political frustration that had been building in New Spain. Hidalgo's call for independence was sparked by a mixture of personal and political motives, including his own dissatisfaction with the peninsular control over the local economy and the oppression of indigenous peoples. His movement quickly gained momentum among peasants and indigenous groups, who saw this as an opportunity to challenge centuries of oppression. Hidalgo, along with other leaders like José María Morelos and Vicente Guerrero, became the faces of the independence movement. Despite the growing support, the insurgents faced a formidable enemy in the Spanish royalists, who were determined to suppress the rebellion and maintain their control over the vast and rich territories of New Spain. The rebellion, however, was not a simple matter of a few determined leaders fighting against the colonial power. Mexico and New Spain as a whole was a patchwork of social, ethnic, and economic divisions that complicated the unity of the independence movement. While the indigenous and mestizo populations were motivated by a desire for land and freedom from Spanish rule, the Creoles, descendants of Spanish settlers, had more complex motivations. Many Creoles supported the rebellion to challenge the dominance of the Peninsulares, but were hesitant to support complete social upheaval, especially since they were concerned about the redistribution of land and power. The initial phase of the war was marked by early successes for the insurgents. Hidalgo's army, though poorly equipped, managed to take key cities, including Guanajuato and Celaya. However, the lack of a unified strategy and leadership quickly caused friction within the insurgent ranks. The rebels were also up against a highly organized and disciplined Spanish military, which, although initially caught off guard, began to regroup and push back. In 1811, the insurgent army suffered a major defeat at the hands of royalist forces, leading to the capture and execution of Hidalgo. His death did not, however, mark the end of the struggle. José María Morelos, a former priest who had taken up Hidalgo's banner, emerged as the leader of the movement. Morelos, a man of both military skill and vision, reorganized the insurgent forces and pushed for a more structured and unified approach to independence. His strategic mind and charismatic leadership helped the movement gain significant momentum, especially in the South. Despite the advances of the insurgents, the war would stretch on for more than a decade, with both sides enduring immense losses and facing internal divisions. By the time 1820 rolled around, the Spanish crown was weakened by other struggles, including the war for independence in Spain and the growing threat of foreign intervention. This made it increasingly difficult for the Spanish to maintain control over New Spain. And it was in this climate that the Treaty of Córdoba was signed in 1821, officially recognizing Mexican independence. But, as with any revolution, the new nation of Mexico did not emerge as a unified entity. The social and political divisions that had plagued New Spain throughout its colonial history persisted in the newly independent country. The Old Guard, including the military and conservative elites, found themselves at odds with the more liberal factions that wanted to establish a republic based on democratic principles. The question of land reform and the distribution of wealth continued to divide the population. And even as Mexico gained its independence, the country was left with deep social and economic inequalities. Historians still debate the nature of the Mexican War of Independence. Was it a true revolution driven by the desire for freedom? Or was it simply a series of political maneuvers by the Creole elite to gain more control? Some argue that it was a popular uprising, with the indigenous and mestizo populations at the forefront, while others see it as a more elite-driven movement, with the Creoles trying to secure their own power without radically changing the social order. The reality, as always, lies somewhere in between. The war did bring about political change, but it left much of the old colonial structure intact. In many ways, Mexico's independence was a process of replacing one set of rulers with another, albeit with some reforms that would have long-term consequences. At the heart of the struggle for independence was the desire to establish a new national identity, free from the control of Spain. However, the difficulties of governing such a large and diverse nation meant that unity would remain an elusive goal. The new Republic of Mexico, though officially independent, was still in the process of defining itself, both politically and socially. By the time Agustín de Iturbide declared himself Emperor of Mexico in 1822, it was clear that the new country was deeply divided. Iturbide's reign was short-lived, and within a few years, Mexico would find itself in the midst of yet another struggle for political control. The struggle for identity continued, with factions fighting over how best to organize the country. Would it be a monarchy, a republic, or something else entirely? As Mexico moved into the 1820s, it found itself struggling to define its place in a world that was rapidly changing. The legacy of colonial rule, combined with the fractured nature of its independence, left the country in a precarious position, both internally and on the global stage. The next few decades would see Mexico grappling with the complexities of independence, political stability, and national identity, issues that would continue to define the country for years to come. As Mexico entered the 1830s, the country was far from stable. The new nation was struggling to define its identity, and the political system was still very much in flux. Agustín de Iturbide, who had briefly declared himself Emperor of Mexico, was ousted in 1823, and the first Mexican Republic was established. However, the new republic faced immediate challenges from both internal and external forces. Political factions, many of which were divided along lines of conservatism versus liberalism, fought for control over the future of the country. The centralists, who favored a strong, centralized government, sought to maintain order by limiting regional autonomy, while the Federalists believed in a more decentralized system that would allow for greater local control. These ideological differences led to a prolonged period of instability, as power shifted rapidly from one faction to another. The question of whether Mexico should have a strong central government or a federal system continued to haunt the country for decades, ultimately shaping the course of its political evolution. By 1835, the federalist system was abandoned, and a centralist government took power, leading to an era marked by political turmoil, military coups, and power struggles between different factions. Antonio López de Santa Anna, a general and political leader who had already played a key role in Mexico's fight for independence, would dominate Mexican politics for the next several decades. Santa Anna's leadership, while deeply influential, was also highly unstable. He switched political allegiances several times, aligning with both Federalist and centralist factions at different points in his career, further deepening the political chaos. Santa Anna's leadership during this period was marked by a series of military coups, and in 1833, he became the president of Mexico. However, his presidency would be short-lived. His first term was marked by significant political instability, and his decision to temporarily step down in favor of Valentin Gómez Farías was followed by a series of political conflicts that would lead to Santa Anna's return to power just a few years later. The most notable event during this time was the Texas Revolution in 1836, which would have profound consequences for the young nation. Texas, which had been part of Mexico since the country gained its independence from Spain, had a significant American population that was dissatisfied with Mexican rule. The tensions between the Texans and the Mexican government culminated in the Battle of the Alamo, where a small group of Texan rebels fought to the death against a much larger Mexican force. While the Texans were ultimately defeated at the Alamo, the battle became a symbol of resistance, and the rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo," would inspire the Texans to win their independence just a few weeks later at the Battle of San Jacinto. The loss of Texas was a major blow to Mexico's national pride and territorial integrity. In the wake of the revolution, Mexico was forced to recognize the independence of Texas, a loss that would have significant ramifications for the future of the country. As Texas sought to join the United States, Mexico's weakened political position made it difficult to defend its territorial claims. The Texas issue would eventually lead to the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, a conflict that would further challenge Mexico's sovereignty and territorial boundaries. While Mexico struggled with internal divisions and external threats, it also faced serious economic difficulties. Debt from the Wars of Independence, combined with political instability, made it difficult for the country to develop a strong, sustainable economy. Mexico's wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while the majority of the population, primarily indigenous and mestizo, lived in poverty. Despite the agrarian reforms and efforts to modernize the economy, the country continued to struggle with inequality and underdevelopment. Internally, Santa Anna's rule was increasingly unpopular. His authoritarian tendencies and his frequent changes in political allegiance left many Mexicans disillusioned with his leadership. Santa Anna's centralist policies and his disregard for the constitutional framework angered the liberal factions of Mexican society, while his increasingly militaristic rule led to a lack of trust in the government's ability to manage internal issues. His reign also coincided with the growth of regionalism, as different parts of Mexico sought more autonomy from the central government. The absence of a coherent political structure made it difficult to establish a stable national government. The tensions surrounding Santa Anna's rule, combined with the loss of Texas and the challenges of managing the country's growing population, would eventually lead to more conflict in the coming years. The nation's future was uncertain, and it was clear that Mexico would need to address its internal divisions and weaknesses if it were to survive as a unified and sovereign state. Historians still argue over the exact reasons behind the failure of the First Mexican Republic. Some claim that it was the incompetence of Santa Anna and other leaders, while others argue that the inherent contradictions of the Mexican political system made it impossible for the country to thrive in its early years. Mexico's struggle for political stability was compounded by the region's diversity, with numerous ethnic and social groups vying for influence. The country was torn between the desire for centralized authority and the need for local autonomy, a tension that would continue to shape its political landscape for much of the 19th century. As Mexico entered the late 1830s and early 1840s, the country faced an increasingly unstable and fragmented political environment. The loss of Texas in 1836 left a deep scar on the national psyche, and the failure to prevent Texas's independence became a source of national shame. Mexico's internal divisions seemed to deepen, and the political turmoil that followed would only worsen. In addition to the internal strife, Mexico found itself drawn into conflicts with external powers, particularly with the United States. The struggle for control over Texas would prove to be the opening salvo in what would later become the Mexican-American War. Following the Texas Revolution, Texas declared its independence, and, soon after, it sought annexation by the United States. Mexico vehemently rejected this move, considering Texas as an integral part of its territory. As the United States expanded westward, tensions escalated between the two nations, particularly over the status of the border. The disputed borderlands between Texas and Mexico would ultimately become the trigger for the broader conflict. Meanwhile, Mexico's internal situation remained turbulent. Santa Anna's authoritarian leadership had alienated many parts of the population, especially the liberals who were pushing for a more decentralized and democratic system. Santa Anna had abandoned the federalist model of government in favor of a centralist approach, which only deepened the divide. By 1839, the Federalist forces had staged a rebellion against Santa Anna's government, but they were unable to secure lasting political stability. The centralist faction, however, continued to dominate the political landscape. One of the most notable developments during this period was the rise of Antonio López de Santa Anna as an enduring figure in Mexican politics. His political maneuvering and repeated return to power after being overthrown showed just how fragmented Mexico had become. Santa Anna's political longevity was largely due to his ability to align with different factions and play off their rivalries. He shifted his allegiances between the liberals and conservatives, never fully committing to one side, but always positioning himself as the figure capable of maintaining order. By 1841, Santa Anna once again became president of Mexico. However, his return to power marked a period of military dictatorship rather than true governance. He ruled through a combination of military strength and political maneuvering, while repression became the hallmark of his leadership. His authoritarian rule continued despite widespread opposition from various political factions. The most significant external challenge that Mexico faced during this period was the threat of war with the United States. The issue of Texas remained unresolved, and in 1845, the United States annexed Texas, which prompted an immediate response from Mexico. The United States considered the annexation a straightforward matter, but to Mexico, it was a direct violation of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mexico severed diplomatic ties with the United States, and tensions began to mount over the disputed border. The U.S. government supported Texas's claim to the Rio Grande as its southern boundary, while Mexico argued that the border should lie at the Nueces River. In 1846, the situation reached a boiling point when a skirmish broke out along the disputed Texas-Mexico border. The clash escalated into full-scale war, marking the beginning of the Mexican-American War. Mexico, already weakened by internal divisions and political instability, found itself ill-prepared to face the United States, whose military was far superior. The war would soon become a profound turning point for both nations. Historians still debate the underlying causes of the Mexican-American War. Some argue that it was the expansionist ambitions of the United States that led to the conflict, as the U.S. sought to expand its territory across the continent. Others argue that Mexico's inability to resolve its internal political instability and its failure to properly address the Texas issue contributed to the war. Regardless of the causes, the war would have profound consequences for both Mexico and the United States, reshaping the political and territorial landscape of North America. The Mexican-American War would be a crushing defeat for Mexico. The United States, using its superior military technology and resources, rapidly advanced into Mexican territory. By 1847, U.S. forces had captured Mexico City, the capital, forcing the Mexican government to negotiate for peace. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ended the war and resulted in Mexico ceding a vast amount of land to the United States, including parts of modern-day California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. This territorial loss was a devastating blow to Mexico, not just in terms of its land, but also its pride and national identity. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo marked the end of the Mexican-American War, but it did not bring immediate peace or stability to Mexico. In fact, the terms of the treaty left a lasting legacy of resentment and division within the country. The vast territorial loss, over half of its land, was a blow that Mexico never fully recovered from, both economically and politically. The northern territories that Mexico ceded to the United States would become key regions in the growth of the U.S., while Mexico struggled to maintain its own fragile identity.
The treaty was ratified by the Mexican government under pressure, but it was not accepted by all Mexicans. For many, it was seen as a humiliation that symbolized the failure of Mexican leadership to protect the country's sovereignty and integrity. In the years that followed, political instability only deepened, and the war with the United States was just the beginning of a turbulent period for Mexico. Internally, Mexico was still reeling from the constant political upheaval. Santa Anna, who had once again risen to power, was forced into exile after the defeat, but his political influence had already left a deep imprint on the country. The successive presidential transitions were marked by violence and corruption, with no stable system of governance taking root. Mexico's leaders were either military figures or landowners who struggled to maintain order and unity. By the mid-19th century, Mexico was trapped in a cycle of economic stagnation and social inequality, which was exacerbated by the ongoing political fragmentation. The country faced major challenges, including a crippling debt and an inability to effectively govern the vast territories that it still held. The growing power of the United States, now strengthened by its acquisition of new territories, only further complicated Mexico's position in the global landscape.
At the same time, Mexico's social divisions deepened. The elite, who controlled much of the land, were largely indifferent to the suffering of the rural population. The peasantry faced harsh conditions, struggling with landlessness, poverty, and a lack of access to education. Many indigenous groups, who had already suffered from centuries of colonization, were further marginalized by the growing power of foreign interests and the new economic dynamics that the United States brought with it.
Mexico's reliance on a largely agrarian economy limited its ability to modernize. Its dependence on mining and agriculture, two industries that were easily exploited by foreign interests, further cemented the economic inequality. By 1850, the country was deeply in debt to European powers, and Mexico had lost much of its economic independence. While some attempted to modernize Mexico's infrastructure, the country's political instability and lack of resources meant that progress was slow and inconsistent. As Mexico struggled to assert its sovereignty in the wake of the Mexican-American War, reform movements began to gain traction. These movements were led by liberals who sought to restructure the country and break away from the hold of the Catholic Church and the military elite. One of the most notable reformers was Benito Juarez, a Zapotec lawyer who rose to prominence during this period. Juarez, who would later become the president of Mexico, championed constitutional reform and separation of church and state as a means of modernizing Mexico and reducing the power of the military and church. Historians still debate whether Mexico's post-war reforms were enough to counteract the damage inflicted by the Mexican-American War. While figures like Juarez pushed for reform, the country remained deeply divided, and the political system failed to produce long-lasting stability. Some argue that the United States' increasing influence over Mexico's territorial losses hampered the nation's ability to regain its footing, while others believe that internal class struggles and conservative forces ultimately derailed any meaningful progress. The political and social turmoil that Mexico experienced during the mid-19th century laid the groundwork for the more significant struggles that would come in the following decades. The United States continued to grow and assert its dominance in the Americas, and Mexico, despite its efforts to reform, struggled to reconcile its past colonial legacy, its territorial losses, and its internal divisions. In 1857, the Constitution of 1857 was enacted, marking a significant moment in Mexico's history. This new constitution sought to enshrine the principles of democracy, liberalism, and individual rights. It was a revolutionary document that challenged the existing power structures, especially the authority of the Catholic Church and military. However, the Constitution's implementation was contested, and it further polarized the already divided nation. The conservative and liberal factions fought over its interpretation, leading to the War of Reform in the late 1850s. The War of Reform, 1857 to 1861, was essentially a civil war between these two factions, each trying to establish its vision for Mexico's future. The liberal forces, led by Juarez, ultimately triumphed, but the war weakened the country significantly. By 1861, Mexico was in a state of near collapse, with a broken economy and a divided society. It was during this period of vulnerability that foreign powers, notably France, would intervene.
Historians often point to the French intervention in Mexico, which began in 1861, as one of the most tragic chapters in the nation's history. Emperor Napoleon III of France, seeking to establish a puppet monarchy in Mexico, attempted to install Maximilian of Habsburg as emperor. This intervention set the stage for a violent struggle between the liberal forces, led by Juarez, and the French-backed conservatives. While Juarez and his forces managed to resist the French invasion, the events of the French intervention would leave an indelible mark on Mexico's history. The conflict weakened the nation even further and made clear the deep political rifts that still existed. Despite these challenges, the struggle also showcased the resilience of the liberal forces and the enduring leadership of Benito Juarez, who became one of the most revered figures in Mexican history. Historians still debate the legacy of Juarez and his reforms. While many view him as a hero of Mexican liberalism, some critics argue that the political instability and social divisions that plagued Mexico throughout his presidency left the country in a fragile state. However, his ability to fend off foreign intervention and preserve Mexico's sovereignty is still celebrated as a pivotal moment in Mexican history. After Mexico successfully resisted the French intervention and ousted Emperor Maximilian in 1867, Benito Juarez became a symbol of resilience and national pride. His leadership during this turbulent time had helped preserve Mexico's sovereignty, but it also marked the beginning of a new set of challenges. The end of foreign intervention did not translate into immediate peace for Mexico. In fact, the country was left to deal with the aftermath of war, political instability, and economic struggles. Juarez's reforms, which had aimed to modernize Mexico, were deeply divisive. While the liberal policies were focused on reducing the power of the military and the church, as well as implementing land reforms that promised to give land to the peasants, the conservative opposition saw these changes as a threat to the traditional social order. These tensions would manifest in violent uprisings and protests, particularly from the Catholic Church, which had lost much of its power under Juarez's laws. The church-state conflict became one of the defining struggles of post-intervention Mexico. Despite these challenges, Juarez remained firmly committed to his vision of a modern Mexico, focusing on building a legal framework that emphasized individual rights and liberty. His greatest achievement during his presidency was the reform of the judicial system, which sought to create an impartial system of justice. However, his efforts at reform were stymied by powerful elites, and his presidency was marred by continued resistance from local rulers, church leaders, and military figures who clung to the old ways. By 1871, Juarez's political position had been weakened by internal resistance. He was re-elected as president, but his popularity began to wane, and opposition from the growing conservative faction in Mexico became more vocal. Historians still debate whether Juarez's continued presidency helped stabilize the country or whether it prevented the necessary political change. The economic burden from the ongoing conflicts and the continued influence of the church and military only deepened the country's struggles. In the final years of Juarez's presidency, Mexico was still under the shadow of political unrest. The economy was in disarray, and the country was facing rising foreign debt. In fact, the continued drain on Mexico's resources became a focal point in Juarez's relationship with the United States. Mexico was unable to fulfill its loan obligations, which led to tensions with its northern neighbor. The U.S. had provided financial support to Mexico, but by the 1870s, the Mexican government struggled to repay these loans, leading to diplomatic conflicts. The struggle for control over Mexico's future continued, even after Juarez's death in 1872. His successor, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, was faced with a country that was divided and struggling to modernize. However, it was under the leadership of Porfirio Díaz, who would later seize power, that Mexico would undergo one of the most significant shifts in its political and social history. Díaz's rise to power marked the end of the liberal reforms
and the beginning of a long period of dictatorship that would change the country forever.
Historians still argue whether Juarez's reforms ultimately weakened Mexico by alienating key institutions, such as the church and military, or whether his attempts at modernizing the nation were simply too ahead of their time. Regardless, his legacy as a leader who fought for Mexican sovereignty in the face of both foreign and domestic adversity has remained an enduring part of the country's history. His role in protecting Mexico's independence and creating a foundation for legal reform remains a cornerstone of the country's national identity. However, even as Juarez's reforms were being implemented, the economic and political instability in Mexico remained. The loss of nearly half of the country's territory during the Mexican-American War had left scars on the Mexican psyche, and these scars would continue to haunt the nation for decades to come. Despite the attempts at reform, Mexico's economic dependence on foreign investments, especially from the United States and Europe, left the country vulnerable to outside influence. Mexico was caught in a cycle of debt, with foreign powers continuing to hold significant sway over its future. During the late 19th century, Mexico's internal instability, combined with its increasing reliance on foreign capital, led to the rise of dictatorial rule. The most notable of these leaders was Porfirio Díaz, who seized power in 1876 and would go on to rule Mexico for over 30 years. Díaz's regime, known as the Porfiriato, marked the beginning of Mexico's shift toward authoritarianism, with significant consequences for the country's social and economic structure. Historians still debate the true nature of Díaz's rule. Some view his reign as a period of modernization, as Díaz sought to strengthen Mexico's infrastructure and encourage foreign investment. Others argue that his authoritarian rule ultimately hindered the country's development, as it suppressed political opposition and allowed the elite to consolidate power at the expense of the rural population. One of the key aspects of Díaz's rule was the expansion of railroads and the development of the country's mining and agriculture sectors, which were heavily reliant on foreign capital. While this modernization brought some economic growth, it also deepened Mexico's dependency on foreign nations and left the majority of its population living in poverty. Díaz's regime was also characterized by repression, with the government using force to silence political opponents and control the population. Despite the economic growth seen in certain sectors, the disparity between the rich and poor in Mexico grew significantly during Díaz's rule. While the elite enjoyed the benefits of a booming economy, the peasantry and indigenous communities suffered under exploitation, particularly in the agricultural sector. The land reforms that had been implemented by Juarez were undone by Díaz, who granted vast tracts of land to foreign companies, leaving little for the native population. In the decades following Juarez's death, Mexico would continue to experience both internal struggles and external pressures, leading to one of the most profound transformations in its history. While Juarez had sought to modernize the country through legal reform, land redistribution, and secularization, Díaz's rise to power brought a new set of challenges that would eventually culminate in the Mexican Revolution. Historians still argue whether Díaz's policies were a necessary step in the modernization of Mexico, or if they were merely a means of securing power for himself and the elite. Regardless of the debate, the Porfiriato marked a turning point in Mexico's history, as the country moved toward a future defined by revolution and political change. As the turn of the century approached, Mexico stood on the brink of monumental change. The Porfiriato had created an economic boom for the elite, but it had simultaneously sown the seeds for social unrest. The discontent among Mexico's peasants, workers, and indigenous communities reached a boiling point, as the growing inequality became impossible to ignore. Beneath the veneer of modernization and progress, Mexico was facing a stark divide. A divide between the prosperous urban elite and the impoverished rural population that lived under constant exploitation. The Mexican Revolution, which would begin in 1910, was not a spontaneous uprising. It had been brewing for decades. The moral and social fabric of the country had been weakened by years of land concentration in the hands of a few, the harsh conditions in the rural areas, and the lack of political freedom. Díaz's authoritarian regime had stifled dissent for over 30 years, but the cracks in his system were beginning to show. The middle class, especially the intellectuals and students,
became increasingly vocal in their opposition to the regime, demanding democratic reform and greater social justice. The catalyst for revolution came in the form of Francisco Madero, a wealthy landowner and reformist politician who had grown disillusioned with Diaz's rule. Madero called for a free and fair election in 1910, challenging Diaz's authoritarian regime. However, when Diaz, in a predictable move, fraudulently rigged the election to ensure his victory, Madero responded by launching the Plan de San Luis Potosí, a call for armed rebellion against Diaz. His call was answered by millions of Mexicans who were tired of being ruled by a system that left them in poverty and political subjugation. As Madero's movement gained traction, he found unlikely allies in a diverse coalition of rebels, including Emiliano Zapata, a revolutionary leader from the south, and Pancho Villa, a former bandit-turned-general who led forces in the north. Zapata's call for land reforms, encapsulated in his famous slogan, Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, resonated with the peasants who had been dispossessed of their lands under the Porfiriato. Villa's forces, known for their guerrilla tactics, quickly became a powerful force in the north, while Zapata's Ejército Libertador del Sur fought for the rights of the indigenous and landless campesinos in the southern states. The revolution was not just about overthrowing Diaz. It was about reclaiming Mexico for its people. However, the revolutionaries quickly realized that they were not fighting against just one man, but an entire system of corruption, inequality, and authoritarianism that had been deeply ingrained for decades. Diaz, despite being initially overthrown in 1911, still held significant influence, and Mexico's political landscape remained unstable. Historians still debate whether the revolution could have been avoided, or whether Diaz's harsh policies had already set in motion the inevitable collapse of his regime. Some argue that if Diaz had implemented reforms earlier, he could have avoided the revolution. Others believe that the social and economic systems that he put in place were inherently unjust and could never have led to a sustainable, peaceful society. Regardless of these debates, the Mexican Revolution is a turning point in Mexican history, shaping the country's future and leaving a legacy that would endure for generations. Madero's leadership, while initially promising, was ultimately weakened by the complex array of forces fighting for different causes. As he struggled to keep the various factions united, his government became embroiled in power struggles with other revolutionary leaders. Zapata remained staunchly committed to land reform, while Villa sought to expand his control in the north, and Madero's political enemies worked behind the scenes to undermine his authority. In 1913, Madero was overthrown in a military coup led by Victoriano Huerta, a former general in the Diaz regime. Madero was arrested and killed under questionable circumstances, marking a dark chapter in the revolution. Huerta's dictatorship was short-lived, as the revolutionaries, led by Venustiano Carranza and Álvaro Obregón, rallied to fight against his regime. The Constitutionalist Army, as they were known, eventually forced Huerta to resign in 1914. But the revolution was far from over. Mexico had become a battlefield between various factions, each fighting for their own vision of the country's future. The Constitution of 1917 marked a key moment in the revolution, as Carranza's government enacted sweeping reforms that addressed issues of land redistribution, workers' rights, and religious freedom. While the Constitution laid the groundwork for a more democratic and socially just Mexico, it also highlighted the deep divisions within the country. The revolutionary ideals of Zapata and Villa, particularly their focus on land reforms, were only partially fulfilled, and political instability continued for years to come. The revolution led to the emergence of a new political order, but the battle between reformers and conservatives continued to shape Mexican society throughout the 20th century. The institutionalization of the revolution, in the form of the PRI, Institutional Revolutionary Party, marked the beginning of a long period of political dominance by a single party. The PRI would control Mexican politics for the next 7 decades, though not without contestation and challenges. While the Mexican Revolution was a significant victory for the masses, It also left a legacy of conflict and disillusionment. Many of the promises made during the revolution, particularly regarding land redistribution and equality, were never fully realized, and the country continued to face challenges related to poverty, corruption, and social inequality.
Historians still argue over whether the revolution was truly a success.
Some see it as a necessary rebellion against the injustices of the Porfiriato, while others view it as a revolution that fell short of its promises. One thing is clear, however. The Mexican Revolution irrevocably changed the course of Mexican history, shaping the nation's political, social, and cultural identity for generations.
As we reflect on the legacy of the Mexican Revolution, it's important to remember the contributions of the revolutionaries who fought for land, freedom, and justice. While the promises of the revolution were not fully fulfilled, the ideals of equality and democracy continue to inspire Mexicans today as they work toward building a more just and equitable society.